Hello, everyone, and welcome to Investing by the Books, a podcast by Redeye. I'm your host, Eddie Palmian, and with me in the studio is my friend and colleague, Niklas Sävås. In this episode, we are delighted to have Phil Rosenzweig on the show. For nearly 30 years, Phil has been a professor at one of the world's leading centers for management research and education, the IMD Business School in Lausanne, Switzerland. So, Niklas, which book will we speak about?
Today we will speak about Phil's legendary book, The Halo Effect, which debunks a lot of the classic management literature such as Jim Collins' Built to Last and Good to Great. Phil explains how we tend to think that when a company performs well, the CEO is fantastic, the company has operational excellence, and the employees love to work there. While when it underperforms, all these factors move in the opposite direction. We set a halo on the good performers.
And what do you think about the book?
I first read it back in 2016, and it has influenced my thinking a lot. I think this is a book that makes you question a lot of truths that you hold dear, making it a bit extra special. And I think the best part of the book is the first half, where we get the proof about why most of the management literature out there don't stand the test of science.
Nassim Taleb has said that this book should stand as one of the most important management books of all time. The Halo Effect and the 8 Other Business Delusions That Deceive Managers was first published in 2007, and we are thrilled to have the author on the show today. Here comes our conversation with Phil Rosenzweig. Hello, Phil, and welcome to Investing by the Books podcast.
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
We're honored to have you on. Where are we reaching you today?
I live in the north of England. I don't have an English accent. I'm an American with a French mother, an English wife, and I worked in Switzerland for many years, but the family home is in England.
And to begin, where did your passion for business start?
I studied economics in college, and I probably would have stayed with economics, except that the way it was taught in those days and researched, it was very theoretical and mathematical, and I was more interested in the applied part of economics, so that brought me into business administration. But then after a few years working for a company, realized that I was more interested in the academic side of business, so that's where I've wound up, studying, teaching, writing about business and the way people behave in the business world.
And today we will speak about your excellent book, The Halo Effect. Can you briefly describe what the halo effect is?
Sure. So the halo effect is a phenomenon in psychology where a general impression leads people to make very specific judgments. And it's been known now for about 100 years. It was identified by an American psychologist named Edward Thorndike, who was looking at data from the Army of how Army officers evaluated their soldiers. And he found that some soldiers were thought to be great at everything, and some soldiers thought to be bad at everything. And he thought he didn't really believe that, and he thought something else was going on. And what he called the halo effect is when a soldier was very good and was very good at some things, it created an overall impression that then led to attributions across everything. Well, we've seen the halo effect in many places, but in the business world, at the level of companies, it works something like this. If a company is a high performer, revenues are up, profits are up, share price is up, it's very easy to imagine that they have a brilliant strategy, they have a very able leader, the people are motivated, you're great at listening to customers, you're great at execution, and so forth. And some of those are probably true, but they might not all be true, and we have to be careful not to assume that they're true because of the overall impression. So that's the essence of the halo effect.
And how come you wrote a book about this?
Well, so in my academic career for the last many years, I've been a professor at IMD in Switzerland. IMD is not a typical business school. We're mainly involved in executive education. And so beginning in 1996, when I arrived there, I worked with many programs teaching executives from many, many companies. And I began to see something I thought was quite interesting, which is that the executives we had at IMD were very smart and hardworking and honest, but they were not very good at critical thinking. And they tended to believe what they were told or what they read by a best-selling author or a guru or a professor for that matter. And so I began to be concerned that they were too gullible, too willing to believe what they were told by people in authority positions, and not very good at separating good thinking from bad thinking. So I began to collect examples of what I saw as bad thinking in the business world. If I would read an article or if I would see something in a book, I began to collect these and over time began to put them together in a book. The halo effect is probably the most basic of these mistakes, but there are others too. And so over time, it led to this book that was published a few years ago now.
And when did you start collecting those articles and so on?
I began thinking about this in the summer of 2003 and began thinking I had enough to put together in some kind of book in 2004. And then it was a process of working on it, finding an agent, eventually finding a publisher. The book didn't actually come out till 2007, but I wrote it mainly in 2004, 2005, which explains why a lot of the examples are from the early 2000s. After the book came out, a few years later, with the financial crisis of 2008, we decided to write a new edition that only changes by adding 2 chapters at the end. I didn't change anything in the first many chapters, but we added 2 at the end because of the 2008 financial crisis. Otherwise, it's the same book.
And if we go into your book a bit, you start out with some company examples. And as Niklas and I are both from Sweden and we have some listeners from our country, we're curious about your chapter on ABB and its legendary Swedish CEO, Rosenzweig.
Yeah, I think in terms of presentation, it's often helpful to begin with a specific example, a story, rather than talk about the theory. So the way the book begins, I talk about Lego, and then I talk about Cisco, and I talk about ABB. And there's similar examples in that in each case, when the company was doing very well, we said all kinds of great things about them. Gosh, they're great at listening to customers, and they're so adaptable and versatile, and what a visionary leader. And then when fortunes change, people make the opposite attributions. So I begin by talking about Lego, but you're right. In the third chapter, I talk about ABB. Before I got to IMD, I was professor for 6 years at Harvard as an assistant professor. And I had a colleague there who was an expert at multinational management. And in those days, in the early 1990s, I think ABB and Percy Barnevik was probably his favorite example. You could scarcely overestimate the praise that was bestowed on ABB and Barnevik, in particular because so many prominent companies were North American. Here's this European company, and my gosh, aren't they doing well? So for a number of years there, the company, but in particular the chief executive, Mr. Barnevik, were thought to be just superhuman, brilliant. And in the book, I go through a lot of the praise that was heaped upon them by columnists and writers and business school professors. But at the end of the 90s, early 2000s, the fortunes changed for a number of reasons we can talk about. And at that point, everything flipped. And suddenly the people that were praised are now being criticized. The organization design that was rather complex, as long as the company's doing well, they say, oh, this complex organization is one of the reasons for success. When the company begins to do badly, people turn around and say, oh, this complex organization is one of the reasons for failure, and so forth. So that was one example. My sense is Mr. Barnevik, throughout all of it, was pretty much the same man. He was a smart, confident, assertive person. And when the company is doing well, everybody thinks that's wonderful. And when it's not doing well, you're not confident. Now you're arrogant. You're not hard driving. You're, pick your adjective. There's all kinds of ways we say things positively when you're a strong person, and then when things turn around, we use that against you. And that happened with Mr. Barnevik.
And I think this example is also relevant for us. I mean, we look a lot at what we call serial acquirers, companies doing many acquisitions, and they are usually very decentralized in their organizations. And that was also the case with ABB. They had 5,000 profit centers, as you mentioned. This Barnevik was known as the most insistent enemy of bureaucracy, you mentioned, and he was a workaholic, known doing paperwork in the sauna. These kind of legends and myths about the CEO and how the structure of the company was working.
The legends all reflect well on you when the company's doing well. And so are you hard driving, or are you obsessive? Are you demanding? Are you a bully? We see things differently depending on performance. But clearly they had a strategy that worked for quite a while, which had to do with taking these power generation distribution companies in various countries. Obviously, ABB was first a merger of a Swedish company and a Swiss company, finding economies of scale, finding cost savings. They did that very well for a long time, but they also began to make a move a little bit like GE was trying to move out of the industrial segments into more what they called intellectual capital or new economy, and the timing just didn't work very well. I'm not saying it was a good choice or a bad choice. What was interesting to me, and what I think we realize in the book, I was really not explaining ABB. I was explaining how ABB was perceived and how all these serious-looking people who were watching this company really were very quick to make attributions based on performance. And we're not very good at saying, yes, the company's doing well, but I have serious doubts about this or that. This is the halo effect. The overall impression of success leads us to think that everything in the company is good, and not to say, well, overall things are good, but we should be concerned about this or that component.
And I mean, in the book, you make you take these examples, but I mean, as you mentioned there, GE and Jack Welch, I mean, that could be quite fitting in the book as well. And there are so many examples of this. Talk about how you decided to choose these companies that you did.
Well, it's probably going to be very much a function of when I wrote the book. You see the very first chapter, I begin talking about Lego that announced results in 2003. Well, I'm writing this in 2004. ABB, you probably wouldn't write about them today because they've been up and down and now they're doing other things. But that very clear change from having been the darling of everybody to the villain that it is criticized was in very sharp relief and very visible at that time period. Cisco, for a few weeks at the beginning of 2000, before the internet bubble burst, was the most valued company in the world, and then lost 80% of its market share. And again, my story is not about Cisco. It's about the way we thought about Cisco and the extraordinary hype that praised Cisco in the late 90s up until 2000, and then the way it was talked about after that. I don't talk about GE in the book because GE's bubble didn't burst until long after I wrote the book. So I did bring a few things up to date in the later edition, and I talk about a few things that changed, British Petroleum, BP being one of them. So that's pretty much why I chose those books. They were prominent, those companies, those examples, those were prominent companies to talk about at that period of time, to show the way we build things up when they're successful and then we criticize them afterwards. In both cases, I think making specific inferences based on this overall impression.
And I mean, you mentioned now it's 10 years ago since the second edition came out, and I wonder, how common is the halo effect today?
Oh, I think it's just as common. I'm not sure we have quite as many books that are coming out now that are saying, I've crunched a big data set and I've found the secrets of this or that. I don't take credit for that. I don't think it's because we're getting better at the research or because people are worried about comments by people like me. I think these things sort of run in phases. The phase really began in the mid 80s with Peters and Waterman's In Search of Excellence. I met a number of people after that, Jerry Porras, Jim Collins, and others. We're not seeing as much of that kind of thing, but the basic idea of having an overall impression that leads us to think everything is great or everything is poor is just as common. And I think it's also found very much globally. I have a Chinese colleague who says, in her opinion, the Chinese public is even more likely to jump on the bandwagon of a successful company and think they're brilliant, and then when things don't go so well, to beat them up. So the halo effect is something that I think will always be with us. I think some people have become better at detecting it. I hope that in general we're better able to exercise our critical thinking and not be deceived by it.
And I mean, many of the examples that you bring up in the book are examples that you read about in the normal business press, and you
Yep.
mentioned that they were examples that were discussed at the time you wrote your first and second editions. But what company would you take if you would write the book right now?
I'll tell you what I would do. I would look at the most recent Fortune or other magazine that has most rated, most admired company and look at who that is and then ask the question. So a few years ago, for many years in a row, that was Apple. And Apple was not only most admired, it was most admired for everything. Out of the 8 categories, it was in the top 5 for just about everything. And the question to ask is, are they really good at all of those things, or are they good at some things? Are they extraordinary at some things, but that creates a halo that makes us think they're good at everything? When I came out with a UK edition, the UK publisher said, "Can you please find a British example and put that in the preface?" So I did, and I looked at the same, it's not Fortune magazine, it's I think Management Today or something like this, where they again look at companies that are highly rated. And the one that I found there that was a wonderful example was the retailer Marks and Spencer's. So great company for many years, then went through a decline, and then it made a comeback. The comeback is not random. They made some good choices, but because of the comeback, suddenly they rise to the top of the rankings in everything from corporate responsibility to environmental management to people to, you know, all kinds of things. And then a few years later, they fell overall. So Apple would have been a recent example. The one that I haven't looked at, but I would be curious to look at is NVIDIA. So NVIDIA makes chips, right? And they made a big bet on AI chips. They've done extraordinarily well. Does that mean they're good at everything? I would doubt it. I think what that means is they've got some extraordinarily good engineers who did some very good designs, and they made a big bet seeing the way the future was going to go with AI. But if when we look at the reputation that they have, it carries over to all kinds of other things, I would be a little bit suspicious of that. And what I would ask people to do is say, instead of assuming that they're good at all these things, you really have to look at those things on their own. You have to remove the halo and look at that element on its own merits.
And one thing that I want to sort of make certain for everyone listening is that the halo effect, even though we talk about business here, I mean, this is an effect that you could talk about other things as well. I mean, how you think about employees, but also, I mean, people in your sort of friends and family and so on. And I think what I learned from reading Charlie Munger's speech, Psychology of Human Misjudgment, where he discusses liking and disliking syndrome. Sort of, if you like someone, then everything is good. If you dislike something, then you just close your ears and don't listen to the good things that the person has to say. Can you also talk about the sort of how you think about this more broadly, the halo effect?
Well, it's exactly what you said. It's at the level of the company, but it's at the level of individuals, and we see that in business. If I'm doing performance evaluations for somebody, I might look at whether their department met their targets. And it's easy to say, well, if your department met the target, you must be good at all these various things. You must be good at, driving for excellence, at teamwork, at corporate, at customer responsiveness. If all we're doing is making an attribution based on overall performance, we're failing to understand that you might be really good at these two things, but not so good at those things. So we have to look at those on their own. So that's at the individual level in business, but you see it in politics, You see it in sports. You see that the football team that wins, they say, oh, we won because of our culture and we never gave up and we have great teamwork. And you look at the other team that lost by the slightest of margins, but you say, well, they're not so good at these things. Again, you might have been just as good at desiring to win and working hard and teamwork, but maybe not quite as good, or maybe a break went against you. But because of that binary outcome, we make a whole series of attributions.
I think it's interesting that you mentioned sports. I'm a big, football or soccer fan, and they have this XG score, which tells sort of how many goals you normally should score with the chances you created. So I think we don't have any similar things in business, but I think sports in a way has taken this, at least in my view, a bit further.
That wouldn't surprise me. I don't know a lot about analytics and metrics that have been used in football. I do know sport I know well is baseball. And there was this book that Michael Lewis wrote about 20 years ago called Moneyball, which was a wonderful book. I mean, it's one of these books that I wish I had written because it combines, my interest in sports and baseball and analytics, but he did it absolutely brilliantly. But essentially decomposing a lot of the elements of performance and looking at them objectively in a data-driven way. And you're absolutely right. Now, there are ways to do this better. So, for example, one of the measures that's used in the Fortune survey is innovativeness. Okay. Well, okay, we think companies should be innovative. Well, how do you measure innovation? All they do is ask respondents whether you think this company is innovative. And test after test shows that that is distorted, biased by the halo effect. Show me any successful company, and it's easy to say, oh, yeah, I think they must be pretty innovative. Look how good they're doing. And if they're not doing so well, I guess they're not so good at being innovative. The point is, innovation may be very important, but you cannot measure it simply as an attribution based on overall performance. How can you measure it? Well, there's a lot of ways you can measure innovativeness. How many new products have you released? What share of your revenues are accounted for by products that are newly released? And so forth. There are ways to do it that are data-based and not simply going to be biased by an overall impression. And that's what you need to do, whether it's innovativeness or, goals scored. You need to say, how can I make sure that the halo effect does not overwhelm my understanding of these data? How can I look at them in a way that has some integrity and validity?
And that's a good segue into the next topic, which is sort of a base for your whole book. And I mean, there are tons of management literature out there trying to explain how managers should behave in order to create a great company. Could you please explain, and I think you have done some explanation so far, but what are the common issues you see with these books?
So my book is somewhat critical of some well-known books. And I had a colleague who said to me, Phil, nice book, but you don't want to make your whole career by being critical of everybody. And I said, I agree with you. And I would like to say in my own defense, I think I'm often pretty generous about books that don't make exaggerated claims. Critical thinking is about evaluating claims. And if a book does not make excessive claims, I'm generally very complimentary. So if Jack Welch writes a book about here's what I think it takes to be a great leader, that's fine. I'm happy with that. What I get concerned about are books that say we are gathering a lot of data and we're going to discover what drives performance in a data-driven way with lessons that you can then apply into your company so that you too can become a high-performing company, and make claims of causality. If you do these things, here's what will happen to you. And there are, many prominent books that make those kinds of claims. When I looked at those books, and I should say the first time I read some of those books, I thought they were pretty good. Because, my gosh, These are smart people who work at well-established universities who gathered a lot of data over many years, and the findings seem reasonable. Who can doubt that? The first time I read some of these books, I thought they were pretty good. And then I read them again because we were using them in some programs at IMD. And after I read them a few times, I thought, there's something wrong here. And I realized what was wrong was that the companies are selected based on outcomes. So you can compare some high performers with some companies that performed less well. And then to try to explain that difference of performance, they looked at a lot of data, some of which is quite valid, but some of which I believe is corrupted or biased by the halo effect. And therefore, the problem that you wind up with is instead of describing what drives performance, what you have really done is you've captured the way that successful companies are described, which is exactly the reverse. Okay, so I'm not going to call out these books by name. There are many and they're well known, but they're books that generally say, here's the secrets of success. Why do we think so? Because when we looked at these companies, this is what they did. And I'm saying, well, no, you selected companies based on the outcome, and then you gathered data of how people talked about them, how people wrote about them, but those were unfortunately undermined or biased by the halo effect. So that's the fundamental problem a lot of these books have.
And there are also some other delusions that are in those books. Can you mention a few others?
Well, yes. So I began, as I said a few moments ago, trying to help people become better at critical thinking. And I began to collect common errors that I found in the business world. The one that seemed to be most pervasive and that I wanted people to understand and be aware of was the halo effect. And so that's the first of these delusions and the one that we've used as the title of the book. And that's the one that I really want people to understand. I want people to I want them to avoid the tendency to make simple attributions based on outcomes. But there are some others that are important too. And the most important other one that I mention is what I call the delusion of absolute performance. Most of these books that say, if you do these things, you can be a great company or you can, become an enduring visionary company, whatever. They're very formulaic in the sense that they say, if you do these things, you will be a high performer. Implicit in that is that high performance is absolute, not relative. What do I mean by that? Imagine you're in an industry with 5 other companies. There's 6 of you competing. Imagine that all 6 of you follow that same set of prescriptions. Does it follow that all 6 of you are going to be equally successful? I think we would all understand the answer is no, because your performance is not just based on what you do, it's based on what you do relative to other companies. And that is something that is really problematic in a lot of these books. They give you a formula that says, if you do these things, you will achieve this success. That could be the case if success were absolute. But once we understand that success in a competitive business environment in an industry is better described as relative, we know that can't possibly be adequate. Again, if everybody does it, are they all going to be successful? No. So what does it take to be successful? Well, it takes being different from other companies in some important ways. Well, in what ways? If everybody knew the way to be different and we all did it, we wouldn't be different. So there's always going to be some decision-making under uncertainty in the world of competitive strategy. Strategy is about making choices to be different from rivals in ways that can improve your chance of success. And so that's one. There are many others that we can talk about if you like, but if I could just highlight 2, the halo effect is the most important one about how we make attributions based on outcomes. And the piece about absolute performance is important too, because without that, we could believe we live in a world where we can adopt formulas that achieve success. And I think the nature of competition means that's just not possible.
I think on the subject of absolute performance that you mentioned, I mean, reading Warren Buffett and his annual letters, one thing that's quite clear with his writing, and I mean, of course, he's running this big conglomerate, Berkshire Hathaway, with all these different companies, and he often singles out the companies that has not performed well, and stating that still, I mean, the CEO is at the same level as one of the top performing companies in his company. And I think that's quite rare that you single out. I think you always, I mean, many times, I mean, Eddie mentioned serial acquirers, and we hear when they sort of state that this company has been performing well, we don't get the information if that is sort of due to the competitive position or some great strategy and execution by the CEO for that company. How influential has, if anything, Warren Buffett been to you?
Well, I come from the world of management and not the world of investments. So I'm familiar with him a little bit. What I read about him, I like a great deal. He's a believer in a long-term approach. He is a believer in a contrarian approach. He's a believer in that public opinion overshoots in both directions, and that when things are good, the public opinion will overshoot favorably, and when things go less well, it overshoots the other way. And if you have the ability to be slightly contrarian and long-term patient, you do well. In all those ways, I agree with him enormously. So I think I have a lot of sympathy for the approach that he takes. But again, we come from different worlds.
Yeah.
I'm curious if there is something you have found that you're questioning about him or what he's saying.
I don't really know him well enough to say that. I think I'm curious about the governance of Berkshire Hathaway and exactly what ability the operating, what resources and advantages the operating companies have by being part of the larger company. Because conventional financial theory would suggest that a diversified conglomerate does not really give many advantages. And I think what they have traditionally said is access to capital and protection is pretty much what they provide. I'm wondering if that's all, maybe, but I'm very rapidly, guys, getting into things I don't understand very well. I have a lot of respect for Buffett, and I like the way he approaches things, and I like his irreverence, and I like his common sense approach very, very much.
And now when we have covered sort of the background and the, I mean, core things about sort of the halo effect, I mean, I would encourage our listeners to read the full book, to read all the different examples and all the 9 delusions and so on. But I think we should go on with sort of, I mean, you start with presenting the problem you see, and then you also come up with sort of the way you think managers should think about improvement, focused on strategy and execution. And with strategy, you mean how the company shall differentiate itself against competitors. And with execution, you mean how well the strategy is implemented. And you also mentioned that operational excellence is not a differentiator and therefore not part of the framework. And with this, you present a few examples, Intel and Logitech. And let's start there. Why did you take Intel and Logitech?
Okay. Well, gosh, you've said a lot there. I'm gonna
Hopefully
really
it's right.
Moment. The central problem that I tried to look at in the halo effect was not about high performance and managing companies. It was about critical thinking and how managers cannot be overwhelmed and misled by research by people with, PhD after their name or whatever it may be. So I did that. And then you're getting at something important here, which is, well, it's okay to knock research that you don't think is well done. So what suggestions do you have that are more helpful? And I had a question that I had to ask myself when I was writing this book. How much should I have about what managers should do? And I decided that I didn't want to cover that in this book. And the reason for that is twofold. Well, actually threefold. First of all, it would just be a much longer book, and I didn't want to write a very long book. The second is that the tone of that book would be very different. The tone of the halo effect, it's an irreverent book. I make fun of a few things. I tell a few jokes here and there. It's very much, if I can use parliamentary analogy, it's a book written by the opposition party. Whereas if you're telling people what to do, now you're the governing party, and you have to act somewhat differently. So that would have been a very different tone. And there's a third reason why I didn't want to spend a lot of time in this book about what managers should do, and that's because people might just flip to the end and read that part and not spend time on what I wanted them to spend time on, which is about critical thinking. So for all of those reasons, I decided that this book should not have much about what managers should do. So yes, I talk a little bit about strategy and execution, but very, very short. A subsequent book that maybe we'll talk about is written about, so what should you do? And that book, I'm also proud of it. I think it's a good book, but it did not get much attention and is not as well received. I think because a book written by the opposition party is more fun to read than a book written by the governing party. But yes, to answer your question directly, I did say that when I teach and talk about high performance, I talk about two things: strategy and execution. Strategy is the choices you make to compete successfully in your industry. That means relative to other firms. Strategy is about choice. It's what you do and what you don't do. And having made those choices, how well you carry them out is about execution. That's not rocket science, okay? And nobody's going to say, oh my gosh, strategy and execution, that's pretty basic stuff. The other book, I talk more about what that means. But when you mention operational excellence, the point I was trying to make there, I was building on an article that Michael Porter wrote called What is Strategy? And he made the point that a lot of companies say, we're all about operational excellence. And what Porter was saying at the time, this was early 90s now, was that everybody wants to be good at execution. There's no company out there that doesn't say we want to be good at execution. So it is not the basis of a distinguishing factor. Now, you might say, oh, no, we're going to be so much better at execution than anybody else. That really is a discrete choice. Maybe there are examples like that. But I think what Porter was saying is, if you think that operational excellence is your strategy, that's going to lead you to shift your attention from what are the fundamental choices that you really should be thinking about. And therefore, it can be a little bit dangerous to think that your strategy is about operational excellence. Of course, you want operational excellence and execution to be very good, but that by itself can never be a sufficient differentiator or a sufficient choice relative to other companies. That's the basic idea.
And now let's go into Intel and Logitech.
Okay. So why did I talk about those two? I talked about those two. I had recently read, I see it on my shelf here, one of my favorite books, which is Only the Paranoid Survive by Andy Grove. Andy Grove, longtime CEO of Intel. And Grove articulated, in my view, better than anybody for a popular audience, this idea of making choice under uncertainty, but once you've made that choice, rallying people, motivating people to have confidence to execute it successfully. And that oscillation between understanding the uncertainty, but conveying to people in your organization a sense of confidence about success, I think he did very, very well. So I wanted that example. The Logitech example was completely fortuitous. We were running a program at IMD and we had some guest speakers. It was our big flagship program every June where we have hundreds of managers and a few big guest speakers. And this year, I was maybe 2003 or 2004, Garino De Luca, the CEO of Logitech, came to speak. And I was immediately struck by his modesty, his humility, and his recognition that you make the best choices you can, but you never know you're going to be successful. But having made those choices as best you can, you have to then communicate them in a way that inspires confidence within the organization. Now that's the short answer to why those two companies. In my subsequent book, I tried to expand on that, and I talked about the role of the leader as one that, on one hand, must understand uncertainty and be willing to make risky choices. But having made those risky choices, the face you show to people in the organization, sometimes you don't fully convey the risk involved because you need to inspire people to be successful. And if you told people the great risks that are being run and the dangers ahead, maybe that would be counterproductive. Now, is that deceitful or is that good leadership? We can have that conversation. So that was something I talked about in a subsequent book. But that's the short answer to why Intel and why Logitech. And in both cases, I went back and I read what I wrote just in the last couple of days. In both cases, I said, they've done these things well. Does that mean they're going to be successful forever? No, because the nature of competition is that companies that are high performers in one time period inevitably suffer a kind of regression. The nature of performance in a business setting is breaking out, falling back, having to reinvent, and very few companies can be successful over multiple generations. That's just the way it goes.
And I think it's interesting what you also describe in the book when it comes to strategy and execution. You do mention that it's quite rare to change strategy, but it's very common to blame the execution. And I'm curious why you think that is.
Yeah, I've had many examples of a manager standing before a group of employees and saying, "We have the right strategy, we just need to execute better," and everybody nods. And they all nod because it makes good sense, and it seems to validate the choices the company has made. It's also a way that CEOs say, "I did my job, now you guys have to work harder on your end." Very rarely do you have somebody who says, we're executing really well, but this is not the strategy that's working for us. We're going to have to make a more fundamental shift. It's just harder to admit. It's harder to take that blame, and it moves more slowly because one of the key defining features of a strategic choice, it is that it is difficult to reverse in the short term. If it's easy to reverse in the short term, it's probably not strategic. A truly strategic decision, you don't make them every week. You don't make them every quarter. They have longer term effects, and therefore it's very difficult and painful sometimes to say, as well as we're executing, maybe we've just missed a turn back there somewhere. Far easier to say, come on, guys, we've made the right choice. We just need to run faster.
What I'm thinking is that it's much easier for the board to blame the management. I mean, they select the management team, the CEO, usually, at least here in Europe and many parts of the world. The US is so different, with many of the companies having the same CEO and chair, which is interesting in itself. But having this kind of dynamic that the board selects the strategy and then they say management should execute. And then if things don't go well, then they fire that CEO and they take in a new one. And if that one delivers, then it's fine. What do you think about this?
It could be. I was thinking I think one level down, which is the executive manager, not the board, being responsible for strategy and talking to employees who have the day-to-day job of execution. So I was looking at this level, okay. You're at this level, but I think in both cases there is a question of responsibility and either willingness or not willingness to acknowledge that responsibility.
So, listeners, if you're curious to read more about the findings on strategy and execution, you should then buy Phil's next book that has not been well received so far, but maybe it will stand the test of time. We will see.
So the book was called Left Brain Right Stuff, which I'm not sure that was the best title. I'm not sure that it was presented in quite the best way. But let me just give one idea from the book that I think is important. Remember when we said a few minutes ago that performance is relative, and it's relative to companies in your industry. Well, in some industries, if you're not one of the top very few, you won't be very successful. There's other industries where that's not the case. And so what we introduced there is how much risk need you to take to become successful? What is the requirement of riskiness in a given industry, and how we think about relative performance? So I begin to move in the direction of taking risks. I talk a lot about the dynamic between leaders and employees, and needing to convey confidence and so forth. There's a lot of good things in there, but The Halo Effect is the book that I'm known for, and I'm absolutely fine with that because it's a book that I thought then, and I still think, when you read it, it helps you think critically and not be persuaded by bad research. And it's so natural for people to think, gosh, this study, this article, this book was written by some well-known person with a PhD from some prominent school. They must know better than me. And we don't imagine that we can ask a few questions to get at the validity of data and the validity of findings. And if my book has helped people do that, then I'm very pleased.
And going back a bit to the halo effect and try to link it with investing, a concept investors often discuss is value and momentum, where value investing is often referred to as buying stocks with low multiples, and momentum is a strategy to ride the trend. And I think there seems to be some similarities with your findings. So I wonder if you have done any thinking around this.
So tell me what you think the similarity is with the findings then?
So more or less that companies that have been beaten down should more or less revert to the mean. And when they are beaten down, sort of the stock is beaten down because of this negative sentiment around the stock. Maybe the media reports, on all the bad things that's happening, and the stock gets pushed down too far. And momentum is more or less that the vice versa then, that everyone are so optimistic about this company, and the reports are well received and so on. And of course it doesn't continue forever, but it can go on for quite some time.
And so by that logic, if one takes on the comments or the ideas from the halo effect, do you see that makes one more a value investor or more a momentum investor?
I think both can work in that sense.
Okay.
That's sort of if you start a trend, then everybody will just see the positives on, and that can go on for a while. Similar with the sort of if a stock is beaten down, it's not as negative in reality as everybody thinks.
Right. So I'm not an investment guy, and I'm not really a market watcher. If you ask me if I favor the value approach or the momentum approach, by temperament and probably a few other things, I would be much more on the value side. And the reason for that, it's not that I think something that's beaten down is necessarily going to come back. Maybe it's beaten down because it's terrible and it's going to die. I don't know. But I think...
Value trap.
Possibly. But I do think that momentum, to me, it can turn very quickly. It can turn for uncertain reasons, and I wouldn't want to bank on that very much. And it can also, as I think you said, it can be a kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
If it is not supported by fundamentals, I would guess it's going to drop at some point, and I don't trust that I have the ability to know when it's going to drop. So if I don't have the ability to know better than you or anybody else when it's going to drop, I'm going to stay away from that. But the fundamental idea that, I think it's Benjamin Graham who said that in the short run, the stock market is a voting machine. In the long run, it's a weighing machine. And so momentum, it's the voting. Do they like it? Do they not like it? Well, if you know how to deal with the short-term ups and downs and weighing or voting, God bless you, you're better than I am. I can't do that. What I think I can do is I can say something about the long-term value prospect of an investment. And if you have the patience, and if you have maybe the personal ability to ride out some ups and downs over the long term, I would think that works better. That would be my guess.
And with all your business knowledge, one could think that you also have the potential to be a great investor. So I wonder, I mean, how do you invest your own money?
So I invest my own money when I was in college, I took a course on investments, and the textbook we had was the first edition of a book called A Random Walk Down Wall Street by Burton Malkiel. I'm aging myself now because I was a senior in college in the spring of 1976. And he was talking about, wouldn't it be wonderful to have essentially a low-cost index fund for the market, which essentially did not exist at that time. But Vanguard was founded not long after that, and Malkiel became one of their advisors. So I've been a believer in low-cost index funds for a long time. And I would say most of my investing is in Vanguard or similar low-cost investment funds, index funds. Of course, I like to have a betting interest on a few companies. And here and there, I've, placed a bet on a company, but bets I've held for a long, long time. And so again, we come back to Buffett, who I think was asked, what's the length of time to hold a stock? Or when's the right time to sell the stock? And the answer is never. I can't predict what the top is or the bottom is. If it's a good investment, I'm going to hold it. So I've got some stocks I've held for a long time. So I would say my portfolio is mostly low-cost index funds with a handful of common stocks that I hold and like. And I'll tell you a little secret. I watch the market every day, and I almost never make a sale or a buy. And so you can say, well, why do you watch every day? Same reason I look at the sports scores every day. I enjoy the entertainment of it, but I don't act on it.
So I'm curious, those companies you have selected, what did you base those decisions on when you invested in them?
So before I was at IMD, I'm going to say this, and you can edit it in or you can edit it out. Okay. Before I came to IMD, I taught for 6 years at Harvard Business School. And in 1991, when I was a first-year professor, I went with a colleague of mine to write a case study about Microsoft. And we went out to Redmond, Washington in early 1991. I was a young man I was newly married. I had almost no money, but I just sensed something there. And I came back and I asked myself the question, am I going to feel worse if I buy some Microsoft stock and it fails, or am I going to feel worse if I don't buy it and it continues to do well? And I realized the second. I would kick myself forever if I did not buy some at that point. My total net worth at that time was $50,000. I was newly married, but I bought $10,000 of Microsoft stock. So have I done anything with it? No, but I still have it, and I'm pleased I do.
Well done on that investment. And I'm curious, I mean, you've been in academia for a couple of decades now, but before that you used to work in Hewlett Packard for 6 years.
Yep.
What did you do there?
So after my MBA, I got a job with Hewlett Packard in my native area, which is Northern California. I worked in a factory. I was in our finance department, which doesn't really mean corporate finance because HP had no corporate finance. It meant cost accounting and financial accounting. I learned some really important things at Hewlett Packard, which, by the way, was a great company. I think it no longer is, but it was a great company. It was one of the most progressive and enlightened companies. Dave Packard and Bill Hewlett were not only great engineers, but they were real humanitarians and I think very enlightened. They understood that if you treat people well and you give people opportunities to grow and develop, you can trust them. It was a wonderful company. So I learned a lot there about, I think, good management of organizations, but I learned something else. I learned that I really didn't want to work for a big company. And so after a few years there, I thought, well, I don't want my boss's job and I don't want my boss's job. So maybe I don't really have a future here. Now, if it hadn't been a good company, I might have thought, well, if I go somewhere else, then I'll be happy there. But when you're at a company that's as good as HP and you realize that you're not happy there, then I realized I'm not going to be happy at any large company. What do I really like doing? I like following my own ideas. I like researching. I like writing. I like teaching. So I was able at that time, at age 31, to make a complete shift. And I went from being working in finance at a company to being a graduate student again. And I did that for 4 years. And then since then followed that path.
And now you are Professor Emeritus at IMD. What does this mean and how are you spending your days?
It means that a few years ago I hit age 65. So under Swiss law and for a few other reasons, then I'm still part of the team, but I don't get paid and I don't work in the same way. So I'm not as actively involved. I stay in touch with colleagues and occasionally I do a bit of private work, but otherwise I'm not teaching programs. I'm not working as closely with executives as I was for all those years. I was at IMD for 25 years. I was there from 1996 to 2021 and, saw, of course, extraordinary changes. I mean, in 1996, we were at the very early days of the internet. And now, of course, everything is very, very different in so many ways.
And during those 25 years at IMD, how often did you meet companies and executives?
Every day. Because what you may know or you may not know, aside from an MBA program, which is very good, but quite small, there's only maybe 100 students in the whole program, everything else we do is executive education. Some of the programs we do are dedicated to particular companies. So you get, 40 managers from a given company and maybe you get waves of them and you get to work very closely with that company for a number of years. Or maybe we have what we call open programs or public programs where people come from many different companies. But every day you're working with managers from companies from all over Europe, from the Middle East, from Asia, less from North America, some from South America, from Africa. So it was a wonderful experience. And really, it's because of that I wrote The Halo Effect, because I was meeting these people on a daily basis who, as I said at the beginning, they're smart, they're hardworking, they're honest, but they're not very good at telling the difference between good research and bad research and being able to make that distinction. And so the book I wrote is really a way to empower people to trust themselves to be better critical thinkers and not simply believe what they're told.
Thanks for that, Phil. And I mean, as this is a book podcast, we always want to wrap up with questions about reading and writing. And I mean, you mentioned there are 2 editions of The Halo Effect. Will there be a third?
No, I don't think there'll be a third. We thought it made sense to do a second one because there was something to add on about the financial crisis. If I were to write a third one, I would just update a few examples. If people say, oh, ABB, that's a long time ago, Lego, that's a long time ago, give some new examples. But the ideas and the concepts are still very, very current. And I mean, the fact that we're having this conversation today in 2025 tells me that some things I was beginning to write about almost 20 years ago, still very valid. So no, there won't be a new edition of this one. I hope this one continues to have legs. So I'm glad to get any continuing attention, and I still get attention. I don't get as many emails as I used to, but just last summer I was asked by a group to come and lead a discussion for their reading group. They had picked, they were starting a reading group about business books, and they picked this one first. The logic being that if we learn the ideas from this book, it will make us better readers for the next books. I thought that was wonderful. I felt brilliant about that, and I happen to agree with that. That if you sharpen your skills for critical thinking, you will be a better reader for other books out there.
And you're very, very welcome, of course, to come to Stockholm anytime, and we will arrange a reading circle with you. I
Great.
think there will be lots of investors and entrepreneurs that wants to learn from you and
Thank
what
you.
you have to say. And apart from everything you have done, I mean, you've probably read more management and business books than more or less anyone. So besides your book, what would you recommend our listeners to read in order to improve?
Interestingly, I had a look, of course, at your website, and you list a number of books there. And one book that you list is the book that I always recommend people to read, which is Robert Cialdini's book, Influence. When my two children finished high school and went off into the world, that was the book I gave both of them. And I said that I'm not giving this to you so you know how to influence other people. I'm giving this book to you so you know when other people are trying to influence you. And you are aware of the things that salespeople do, other people do to get you to comply with them. So I always like that book.
So I think I have two daughters as well, and I think I will give them that book as well and tell them that don't accept a drink from a stranger.
It's extraordinary. That book, in my view, is one of the few books that reads almost as compulsively as a novel, but is based by good research and science. And that might be one lesson, but there are many others of how people try to influence you and what you should be aware of. So I think that's a wonderful one. I don't read a lot about investing, but I know that Mal Keel has written now several updated editions of A Random Walk Down Wall Street, and I bought a more recent one a few years ago. I still think it's a great one. I liked Nate Silver's book, The Signal and the Noise, which is about predictive models. I'm less positive about the books that have tried to crunch numbers about what makes great companies. But as I said earlier, I try not just to be, a critic and negative. I enjoy reading people's biographies about their time in business, as long as they don't then make these exaggerated claims. So Andy Grove's book, Only the Paranoid Survive, I think is a wonderful book. He's no longer with us. Intel also has suffered a bit in recent years, but the basic lessons there, I think, are very good ones. A lot of my free reading, to be frank, is not in business. It's in history. I read rather broadly, and I think that's probably a good thing to do. I did read two books recently about GE. I read, what was it called? Lights Out and Power Failure. And the one by William Cohen, I'm going to forget which one he wrote. Maybe it was Power Failure. I thought it was a great book. And trying to understand what had happened at GE, which again, halo effect. When I wrote The Halo Effect, everybody thought GE was this great company. I personally had some doubts, but I hadn't really looked at it in great detail. But I think there are reasons to question some things that went on there. So those are a few reading ideas for you.
Thank you for those recommendations. We'll put them in the show notes. You mentioned earlier that Moneyball was a book that you wish that you have written.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if there is any book you would like to read but not write yourself.
Wow. A book I'd like to read but not write? I haven't even thought about that. I think I'm gonna guard against saying the first thing that comes to my mind because it'll be wrong. But that's a great question. So with your permission, Eddie, I'm gonna take that on board and try to think about it. There's this new movie where about Bob Dylan, with the young man playing Bob Dylan. And I remember Bob Dylan saying, the reason I wrote songs is there were songs I wanted to sing. They didn't exist, so I had to write them. And I think that's a good test. are there books that I'd like to read, but they don't exist, so maybe I have to write them? And so I have some projects I'm thinking about. Too early to say very much, but I think that's a good test. What's out? What is not out there that you would like to read that therefore you have to write? I
We're
think the
keeping
Halo
a
effect is that kind of book, by the way, because if I can say so, I don't think there was any book quite like it before. And then you're going to ask me, well, then why did you write it? And it's not because I was more clever. It's because of two very clear things. One is I was working at a school where I had this day-to-day exposure with managers, and I saw that they were good at some things but not good at critical thinking. But the other thing that one should not underestimate, I taught at a school that did not was not afraid to have us write things that were out off the beaten track. I was not at a school that had tenure. I was not at a school that wanted me to publish in certain journals and not other journals. And so the kind of intellectual freedom that I had at IMD to take an idea and run with it and publish it in an unconventional way was supported. Unfortunately, many of my colleagues at other schools, they read The Halo Effect. They said, oh, I love the book, but of course I could never write such a book. I say, why not? Because it wouldn't be accepted in my school. And so I'll just say one little secret thing about The Halo Effect. I criticize a lot of people in that book, but I never criticize anybody from my own school. That's the one thing I could have. I could have. There were a lot of things that colleagues of mine had written that I think are not very good, but I decided, I swim in the same water with these people and I like them. So the only thing that I deliberately didn't do, I never criticized one of my IMD colleagues. But IMD gave me the freedom and the intellectual confidence to write something that I think many other people maybe would not have been able to write.
I think you knew too much about the halo effect. They would dislike you and put a negative halo on you, I think.
You gotta care about the people you work with. So I had some very interesting conversations with colleagues over lunch. Some who realized that the criticisms I made about others, I could have made about them. And we had some interesting conversations, but I didn't mention them by name. And my colleagues are not worse than others, but we weren't free of the problem ourselves.
But being constrained in what you can write, I mean, that's totally what we see in the business press today, and also in some of the books, of course.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, I mean, you criticize or question the business press quite a lot in your book. What do you think today? Are there any good media sources that are doing a better job?
I know there are some columnists that I like. Jason Zweig at Wall Street Journal, I think he's terrific, and of course comes from a school of thought that is aware of decision biases and psychology of investments. So there are individuals. Are there, when you say sources, are there sources in terms of journals that are better than others? I'm not sure. I know there are some that I'm very skeptical of because probably the best known, most popular ones, well, they want to write a headline story and they will tell the public why this company is great, or I think they often don't have the incentive to ask those next questions. You mentioned one of your previous guests, Bethany McLean. I think she wrote a book with Joe Nocera, didn't she?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I used to really enjoy reading Joe Nocera's columns when he was writing for the New York Times. I don't think he does anymore. I haven't seen his name in a while, but there were a few names like this. You would read people's, you'd say, what's this person going to say? Because they see through some of the nonsense and say things clearly. And I very much enjoyed hers as well. So yes, I'd say individual columnists that I've liked a great deal. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Phil Rosenzweig, for coming on Investing by the Books podcast to talk about your experiences and your great book, The Halo Effect. Do you have something more that you want to add before we finish up?
Well, just it's been a great pleasure, and the examples change, the companies change, but I think the concepts remain very valid, and so I'm always happy to talk about these concepts, and in general, for people to gain confidence that they can exercise their critical judgment and not simply believe what they're told by people who call themselves thought leaders or gurus, and God forbid, who are business school professors. No reason to believe them. Think for yourselves. That's what I would say. So thank you very much for having me on.
Great. Thank you so much. And lastly, where can our audience follow you and your work or get in touch with you?
Well, if anybody wishes to reach me, I continue to have my IMD email, which is phil.rosenzweig@imd.org. And if you can spell my last name, you can find me. If you can't spell my last, no, it's you can always find me there. I continue to be affiliated with IMD in that capacity, and I'm always happy to hear from people if they have questions or comments, or if they've exercised their critical thinking reading my book and they see problems or concerns. I'm happy to respond to those as well.
Thank you so much, Phil. This was a real pleasure.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you so much.
Thank you for listening to Investing by the Books, a podcast by Redeye. Follow us on Twitter at @IB_Redeye and email us at ib.podcast@redeye.se. To improve, we'd love to hear your feedback, so please rate and review us. Notice that the content in this podcast is not and shall not be construed as investment advice. This information is meant to be informative and for general purposes only. For full disclaimer, visit redeye.se. I'm your host, Eddie Palmian, and until next time, I sincerely wish you the best of luck on your journey through life and investing.